This is Mark Patterson, and I am going to open the August New York State Cemetery Board meeting. I hate saying the word August because it means summer is passing. Let me just go through some things that I've gotten fond of doing at the beginning of a meeting because we're sort of in a new era, although it's not as new as it used to be. The meeting's recorded. It's important for everyone to identify themselves whenever they're speaking, each time they're speaking, so we know we can get good minutes. There are opportunities for public participation. You should definitely identify yourself as who you are. We can't always see who you are on the if you're just calling in, so that's important. I don't know. We do a request for attendance, so I think Tony corrected me. We might not need to get everybody if they don't speak, but Tony can go over that later, our council. I don't know if we're going to go into executive session, but if we do, we'll reconvene and come back out to report on the executive session and then adjourn the meeting. So I see all of the members of the board present. I'm Mark Patterson, representing Secretary of State Rosanna Rosado. Jill?
Hi, Jill Faber, representing Attorney General Letitia James.
All right, and Tom?
Thomas Fuller, representing Dr. Howard Zucker for the Department of Health. Great,
thank you all for being here. And we have other members of our staff who are here. Louis Polshek, who's the director, Alicia Young, who's the assistant director, and other staff, and Antonio Melillo, who is our counsel. Let me go over just the agenda. Just again, I found it helpful to remind people how the flow of the meeting will go. Tony will explain new rules for remote meetings and what we've done for public notice to make sure that everybody knows we're following the rules. We'll then approve the minutes. As the agenda says, there's a legislation and rules and regulations report from our council and from our division director. The division director will also give the division report, the vandalism report, and then we'll present various applications for discussion and vote by the board. Again, if we go to executive session, we'll take a vote to do that, then we'll vote to come back out and adjourn the meeting. I'll turn it over now to Tony to explain the new rules for allowing for remote meetings.
Thank you, Mark. Just to where we are, we're operating as we have been under Governor's Executive Order 202.1, which modified the Public Officers Law to permit any public body to meet and take such actions authorized by the law without permitting in-person access to meetings, and authorizing such meetings to be held remotely by conference call or similar service, provided that the public has the ability to view or listen to such proceeding, and that such meetings are recorded and later transcribed, which we are in fact doing. This executive order has been interpreted to suspend the requirement that board members be physically convened or convened by video conferencing, to suspend the requirement that notice of the meeting.
Enter your access code or meeting number
Also,
followed by pound.
let me remind people to, I'm not sure this, to mute your phone when you're not speaking. I didn't say that. That's one of the cardinal laws. So Tony, sorry for that. Can you keep going?
No problem. To suspend the requirement that notice of the meeting in the physical location.
Followed by pound. If you do not know your attendee number, press
It's like someone's trying to dial in. Include the physical location of each board member who is participating by telephone or similar means.
I think somebody has two audios going at once. That's when you get the echo. In any event, please everybody but Tony mute.
So continuing now, we've given the public notice of the meeting and how to attend by video conference or telephone conference, and the board agenda and board material have been placed on the Division of Cemeteries website. So all the proper notice has been given, and the link worked because I used it. We are taking attendance, but attendance is voluntary unless you are a lobbyist or are representing an organization. Then you must identify yourself and your client. And we, as Mark has said, we ask anyone who speaks to the board to identify themselves to keep a proper record. That's it. Thank you.
And since we've covered the posting, are there any questions by members of the board about our status here? I think we're good. Okay, we have, next on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. Does anybody have any questions or comments or additions to the minutes as they were distributed? No? Tony, no? Tom, no?
No, no changes.
All right, thank you very much. I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as distributed and posted on the board. Do you have a second?
I'll second that.
Thank you, Tom. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye, thank you. Minutes are approved. Tony, back to you for our legislation and a portion of the rules and regulations report.
I'll start with legislation. Things actually have been pretty busy. Let me pull up that document. Section report, here we go. Okay. So a few bills have actually passed both houses. This is item 10 on the list. It's Assembly Bill 3429-A, Senate Bill 4284-A. This bill would create a cemetery disclosure form, which would be posted on in the Cemetery Corporation's office and given to every potential customer. The details of the form would be created by the cemetery board and would provide a lengthy list of detailed information for consumers. That was passed July 20th and is awaiting action by the governor. The next item, some minor movements. I'm not even going to discuss those. I'd be surprised if anything else passes other than what's been passed already. This is number 29 on the list, Senate Bill 7155, Assembly Bill 9089. This is the bill, the NYS bill that would permit mergers to respond to our reinterpretation with regard to cemeteries acquiring land that have to be adjoining and subject to limits on acreage. This bill passed July 22 on both houses and is also awaiting action by the governor. Finally, well, not quite finally, almost finally. Number 35, this bill would amend the executive law to make it easier to establish a state veteran cemetery, eliminates requirements for a study, and eases funding requirements. That passed both houses on July 23, and as with the other two, it is awaiting action by the governor. And there's also a new bill. This was filed in the, it's a one-house bill filed in the Senate August 3, 2020. It isn't a cemetery bill per se. It's addressed to all not-for-profit corporations. Would add a new paragraph C to NPCL section 701 to prohibit not-for-profit corporations from accepting state funds unless they have boards of directors that represent the ethnic demographics of the communities that they serve. An interesting bill. I don't know where the impetus of that came from. I mean, we at Department of State have a lot of funds that go to not-for-profits. So it isn't just something of interest to the cemetery board, but as I said, it's a one-house bill. We'll see what happens with it. That's all I have for legislation. I think Lewis will talk about regulation.
Let me just ask if anyone on the board has questions of Tony in terms of the legislation.
No.
Okay. All right. Lewis, do you want to talk about our process of developing some new regulations?
Sure, there's two things going on. Thing number one is the abandonment regulations. I had hoped to share the abandonment regulations, the piece of the abandonment regulations that's been drafted with NYSEC in advance of this meeting. I didn't get to it. It'll go out as soon as we're done. It's again, just lots of throat clearing here. It's an early discussion draft. It has not been reviewed for public comment publication as a proposed rule. We're very far from that step, but we want to get stakeholders input early on to make sure we don't start down the wrong road, and that we're doing something that we all kind of agree is workable, because the purpose here is to try to create a process that will help avoid abandonments. And the piece which we haven't drafted yet, is create an orderly process for them to occur when they do occur. So I'll be sharing that as soon as I can pay attention to it and not be in this meeting with NYSEC. The second piece is the emergency rule on that we adopted on May 1st for allowing for essentially rerouting of cremations using our old authorization form. That rule expired on, I've heard two different dates, either July 29th or July 30th. So at our board's June 9th, 2020 meeting, the board approved making permanent the emergency rule and asked council to explore that. Again, this is a very, very narrow set of circumstances to which it would now apply. On April 30th, we changed our cremation authorization form to allow families to check a box saying if the funeral director believes that they have to go to a different crematory, I'm paraphrasing here, different crematory because of emergency, they can call, the funeral director can call the family and get authorization without doing a new authorization. So you don't need this rule for going forward. So after further consideration, the division and council recommend the board reconsider that. The emergency rule was needed when the pandemic led to a backlog of remains using the old, that had been authorized for cremation using the old form. There's no longer such a backlog under the old form, and any current cremations are going to be authorized under the revised form, which, as I said, allows the family to pre-authorize sending remains to a different crematory, provided that the funeral director then puts them on notice that that's happening. The functional purpose of the emergency rule we've now achieved through the form modification, which is presently in use. Consequently, there's really no need to extend the emergency rule. There's also a little bit of discussion of concern that this would allow people to allow for overriding the family's interest, expressed wishes, because they can check the box if they want rerouting. So that's our recommendation on this. There's really nothing to do if you agree with it, because the emergency rule has expired. And if we wanted to do rulemaking on this, I think we'd have to start from scratch with a notice of proposed rulemaking in the ordinary course of business, which we don't recommend doing.
Thank you, Louis. Does anybody have any questions on what happened there with the emergency rule?
No, I have no questions.
Thank
No,
you, Tom.
neither do I.
Thank you, Jill.
I
Okay.
would ask, Mark,
Yeah.
I would just ask, since the board did vote to make the rule permanent, that they be polled, that they are comfortable now with not making it permanent, because it is their prerogative. So I just want to make sure that the board members are comfortable. Obviously, if the situation comes up where we need it, we could do a rulemaking down the road. So
You don't
just
need a
because
vote. You just need
there's a vote in favor, I think we ought to poll the board members that they're okay with not making it permanent.
Okay, so I'll ask Jill if you're all right with where we are.
Yes, I am, and particularly as Louis described, the new form obviates the need to continue to impose that rule.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, I'm happy with that idea.
Okay, again, I am too. Earlier, we were dealing with the backlog issue. That seems to clear everything up. So it seems like the cons outweigh the pros. So I'm comfortable with it. Thank you, Tony. I'm going to move back to Louis in terms of the division report.
Okay, so happily, we don't have that much to report this month. We have started scheduling meetings our first two are going to be on Thursday. I'm hoping to schedule another two sometime this afternoon for Thursday with cemeteries that didn't fall behind in burials during the emergency, during the height of the pandemic, to figure out how they kept up. And with NYS, we're going to be doing these together with the State Association of Cemeteries. And our idea is that we will be able, hopefully, to come up with, to identify best practices, figure out why these cemeteries didn't fall behind when others did, and not with an eye to blaming or criticizing anyone, but to try to come up with things that work. So should we face a surge in demand for burials again, we'll be able to handle that. Along similar lines, it's not ready for release yet, but we've done a statewide study of cremation capacity, and we're trying to figure out the best way to present that and what recommendations to make, and you'll be hearing more from us on that in the future. It's just not quite ready for prime time, but understand we're using this relatively slow time to, in terms of the pandemic, to figure out what needs to happen if we are faced with a second wave. Other than that, there's really, I don't think anything much new on our end. We did report last month on the successful reorganization of Utica Cemetery. We're working on reorganizing via some type of agreement another cemetery in the city, Rome, New York. It's a right settlement. Hopefully I'll be able to have good news for you by next month on that one.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions of Louis for his division report?
No questions.
No questions. Thank you.
Louis. I think I skipped vandalism, but it's just as well. Do you, Louis?
That goes after. That goes after. Alicia, you want to do it, please?
Sure. So vandalism collections for the calendar year were $441,412. Assessment collections were $253,401. Fiscal year collections from April 1st, 2020, vandalism $57,080, assessment $36,569. The entire 2019-20, $2 million was spent by March 31st. $758,956.81 was still unpaid. We were able to pay $17,392.46 from the current appropriation of $2 million. We also were able to pay $27,715.92 from the 2020 appropriation. Some money was found, so it totaled about $45,000 has been paid out in the month of July. So far, we have granted $246,715.25 in applications. We've collected 1,218 annual reports so far this year, and 30% of those were online forms. And that's it.
Thank you, Alicia. Does anyone have any questions of the vandalism report?
No.
No questions.
Right, thank you. We have two applications for vandalism funds. One is Lakewood Cemetery, and the other is the town of Cicero. Lakewood Cemetery's hazardous monument. Does someone want to present the Lakewood Cemetery application?
I would just ask if you've got questions on that one.
Okay, it's a pretty standard
Yes.
hazardous monument for the amount of $47,407.73, County of Otsego. Does anybody on the board have any questions about that application?
No questions.
No, seems quite straightforward.
Okay, so I'll make a motion to approve the application of Lakewood Cemetery for hazardous funds, subject to the availability appropriation for the amount of $47,407.73. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Tom. All in favor?
Aye.
Town of Cicero is a small application for abandonment funds. There's a couple questions there, so I don't know who wants to present that. Louis or Tony, there's some things that we need to decide as a board on that.
Well, I'll start with the background, and Mike, feel free to chime in if I miss anything. The town of Cicero, the Cicero Cemetery they were struggling. I think they also had trouble with maintaining a board going forward. They were struggling funds-wise. They met back in 2018, and they apparently noticed a special meeting. They advertised it for 3 weeks, and in their own words, at the meeting, agreed to abandon and transfer the cemetery to the town. That was the first we heard of it was after they had already had the meeting. After that, they used some sample resolutions that we prepared a long time ago, and conveyed the cemetery to the town. We've got an accounting from the town as to what they've done with the money, which is nothing. They haven't touched it, and they want all they got was $6,000. It's still there. Almost $7,000. Sorry. All they're looking for is about $5,500 for a mower, which is at the OGS price. They don't have a mower that they can bring into the cemetery, and this one's going to just stay at the cemetery. Those are both required for abandonment funds. Ideally, we would have known about this well in advance of it happening and given them better guidance as to the process of trying to reorganize and abandonment if reorganization is not successful. Having said that, it appeared to us back in 2018, and it still appeared to us, that the board that after a special lot owners meeting, the cemetery did conclude it did determine that there was a meeting at which abandonment, I'm phrasing this carefully, abandonment was the only possible state of the cemetery, at which point afterwards they conveyed it to the town. I know there's a legal question because I'll defer to counsel on this, but conveyance to the town is not the same thing as abandonment. But our view was then and is now that this cemetery was abandoned before conveyed to the town, notwithstanding the fact that they only told us about it after they had their meeting. And we support the application.
All right, so I'm not sure you completely defined the problem. So Tony, your first.
Yeah, no, I'm deferring to counsel to define the problem because it's a legal problem.
Tell us the difference between a conveyance and an abandonment.
Right. So I think let's start with the facts because the facts are critical to the legal analysis. The board of the cemetery, the Cicero Cemetery Association, met on, looks like October 16, and they executed a resolution on October 16. The resolution does not use the word abandonment. It says, we, the sole remaining trustees, resolve to request the town of Cicero to assume the maintenance and administrative duties of the subject cemetery. Agree that upon formal acceptance of the cemetery and aforementioned responsibilities, we will turn over to the town all records and assets. This action is taken in recognition of the fact that a town takeover is the only reasonable course of action to preserve and protect the best interests of the cemetery and families buried in the cemetery. No mention of abandonment, and in fact, it talks about the town accepting, which is an important fact. That was followed by an email 2 days later Jody Rogers from the cemetery to Mike Seelman saying that on a unanimous vote of the trustees, decided to disband and turn over their property and assets to the town of Cicero. Again, they use the word disband, they don't use the word abandon. Mike's email in response is the only one that seems to use the word abandonment. It's from what I can see in the record before the board, word abandonment shows up once. It's an October 19 email from Mike responding back to Jody Rogers at the cemetery. Yeah, and well, actually, she responded back to Mike. Yes, we advertised for 3 weeks about the meeting and it was agreed to abandon. So she repeated the words he had used. But the resolutions are critical here. There's a resolution, subsequent resolution of the cemetery that says, in recognition of acceptance by the town of Cicero, we convey the assets and property of said cemetery to this town. And then the town's resolution, and this is important, it's a resolution to voluntarily take over a cemetery pursuant to not-for-profit corporation law section 1506J. It's specifically cited in the resolution. And that was done in November, just a month after the cemetery had first considered being turned over to the town. My assumption is from this very short time frame that they had been talking to the town before they even had their cemetery board meeting in October and knew that the town was likely going to accept. And that's why they voted to, as a board to turn the cemetery over to the trustees. So why is this all important? Abandonment funds are controlled by the state finance law 97R. Actually, let me get into my memo on this. And it dictates what abandonment funds can be used for. Let's see. Yeah, state finance law 97R. The funds shall be used for the purposes provided in subparagraph 3 of paragraph H of section 1507 of the not-for-profit corporation law. And 1507H3 states the money shall be expended equally for the maintenance of abandoned cemetery, repair of cemetery vandalism, and repair removal of monuments not owned by the cemetery corporation. So the funds may not be used for voluntary takeover pursuant to section 1506J. 1506J provides that the cemetery corporation may convey and transfer its real property together with other assets to a city, village, or town if all the directors of the cemetery unite in the conveyance, and that conveyance won't be effective unless the legislative body accepts, by ordinance or resolution, accepts the transfer. So 1506J is a voluntary takeover by a municipality. Town Law 291 is an involuntary abandonment. The abandonment occurs by operational law, not by agreement of the parties. And the only time abandonment funds can be awarded is when there's been an involuntary, an abandonment under Town Law 291, not a transfer, a voluntary transfer under 1506J. And this is especially important because 1506J allows other municipalities to take over a cemetery voluntarily, not just towns. Town Law 291 obviously is limited to towns, only imposes the burden on towns. So abandonment funds can only be awarded to towns, but if we expand abandonment funds to a voluntary takeover, we've opened the door, wrongfully I would add, to other municipalities to receive abandonment funds. I know it's easy in this case to say, well, it's only $5,000, what's the big deal? But you know, if the board approves this one because it's only $5,000, then it gets a $500,000 one down the line. It can't then reject that one because it's such a big amount, because that would be arbitrary and capricious. So the amount notwithstanding, it's an important issue of law here. And I don't think the record, so one of the things I've provided to the board, their previous memoranda that I've done. This issue of distinguishing between an abandonment and a voluntary takeover has been briefed to division and the board since 2011, at least since 2011. Hold on, please. Okay, sorry about that. All right. So the distinction has been raised since 2011. Division has been advised not to use these voluntary resolutions when it's an abandonment. And in the record before us, it looks very much like a voluntary takeover. They actually had an agreement from the town before they even met and knew that the town would be taking it over when they voted to turn it over. It's one of those issues that looks insignificant because of the funds, but could create precedent that we really, really don't want.
I just want to clarify one thing. We are not suggesting that abandonment funds are available to a cemetery that isn't abandoned, be it to a town, city, or county, or village, or whatever. Our view is what we have here is an abandonment where they then conveyed the property afterwards to the town. And one of the things, just one other wrinkle is that the town on abandonment, the way I understand it, on abandonment, the town becomes obliged to maintain and preserve the cemetery, but doesn't own the cemetery. And there can be issues both with transfer of assets and transfer of financial assets, where we've had to get involved and ask banks to allow the town's access to funds, or I think towns have actually had to go to court to get that access. And the not-for-profit corporation continues in some kind of limbo, and title remains with that corporation unless somebody dissolves it or takes title. So our view on what happened here is not that, oh, it's $5,000, let them have it, even though it's not an abandonment. Our view is this was an abandonment, and then they used the resolution process to convey the cemetery property and its assets to the town. Going forward, determination of abandonment, and once we have those, I think it'll be very clear who's eligible and who's not eligible. Well, on this, we've got what we've got.
So
Go ahead, Joe.
I just have a couple of questions. So in terms of, characterizing it as an abandonment or, or a transfer, what seems significant to me is that this was an acting board group of the corporation officials who got together and as a group made a determination that they wanted the town to take over control and maintenance of the cemetery. And it seems to me that, by virtue of the fact that this was a group that were acting together, controlling the governance of the cemetery, that to me does not represent, that's one indicia of it not being abandoned, that they were able to coordinate and make the determination to meet and agree to convey it to the town.
Although that's often the case where there's a board but insufficient funds. That's often the case, and we actually ask boards to convene a reorganizational meeting to try to save a cemetery from being abandoned to a town. If every time they had a reorganizational meeting, even if it failed, that meant they weren't abandoned, that would defeat the purpose of having a reorganizational meeting, because then they just would refuse to have the meeting.
Well, again,
I just, yeah,
questions. Or
And-
are there more questions for you, Jill? Questions or points of?
I mean, the last thing I'll say, and it's a comment, is that, and I do hear what you're saying, but factually, what they did, as you know, Tony described it, and as you know, my review indicates, is they conveyed assets and property very consistent with 1506J. I mean, that, you know, it's hard to get around that. I think that what they did perfectly meets the definition of 1506J, and so and it's not, you know, amount of money aside. I think it would be. I think we really need to consider the impact of looking at these facts and you know, considering this to be an abandonment that would permit them to receive the funds. I you know, I'm anxious to hear what others think.
Thank you, Jill. Tom, did you have any questions or points of view?
Yeah, I have a question for Louis. Now, Louis, you said that they did abandon the cemetery and then transferred the assets. So it's your opinion that was their, I may be a little more subjective, but what was their intent?
That's what I think their intent was. That they lacked sufficient funds and probably also sufficient people willing to continue to serve as trustees going forward. That would meet the definition of abandonment. The problem here, as is often the case, is that as was often the case, hopefully will no longer be with our new rules, is that we found out about this after the fact. If we knew about it, we would be able to attend the reorganizational meeting. We'd be able to try to help them identify trustees. And if they can't, we'd be able much more definitively to say, they did X, Y, and Z to try to locate new trustees. They failed on that. And therefore, they meet the definition of abandonment because they no longer have a board.
So,
Or they no longer have funds. Like, we'd be able to give a much better story on that. So if our concern is the record isn't good enough on that point, maybe there's more information we can get, or maybe it is what it is and they didn't create a good enough record, and so be it. I'm more troubled with the suggestion that if a cemetery is in fact abandoned, they can't then afterwards convey the assets to the town.
wait, no, that is not the legal analysis you've been given.
No.
Let's be clear here.
I thought that's what Jill was saying.
Not at all.
The fact that there was a conveyance.
Nope.
Okay. So,
No, it's the
Louis, I
fact
want
that-
to respond to a lot of the issues you've raised.
It's the fact that, you know, and maybe it is a matter of a poor record, but I'm not hearing, and I didn't see any indication of an abandonment. If there was an indication of an abandonment, then this is an abandoned cemetery, and then that controls. But that is to me, that's a threshold fact-finding criteria, that there needs to have been an abandonment. I don't see that.
Okay, so
Louis, how many
Let's take over.
conveyances have we seen in the past?
Conveyances?
Yeah.
I'd say the vast majority of abandonments have
No,
proceeded.
no. I'm saying how many of them followed the conveyance process versus abandonment? How many times did that happen?
I can't, we'd have to review paper files. I don't know.
Does it happen much?
Mark, I haven't seen it happen since my 2011 memo to division and the board. I told Chet was the assistant director back then. I made it clear to him, Mike, I mean, Louis wasn't here then, it was Rich Fishman. They've known for 9 years. It's one or the other, it's not both. But there's 4 points I have to raise. Louis talks about the board meeting that the cemetery had, and if only we'd known before that board meeting, we could have intervened. That's not accurate. The board meeting, a cemetery cannot vote to be abandoned. If that's what they did, it's a nullity. We had a cemetery in the town of Bethlehem tell us that they were abandoned, and we told them, no, you're not. You're in too good shape. The fact that a bunch of your board members want to retire doesn't make you an abandoned cemetery. And we actually worked with the town of Bethlehem to reconstitute the board, despite the fact that a majority of the board members felt that they were abandoned. So the vote of the board, the cemetery board in October, before notifying division that if it was a vote that they're abandoned, is a nullity. If it's a vote to voluntary transfer, it's not a nullity, because that they can do. Second, Lewis talked about the fact that in an abandonment, title doesn't transfer. He's right. And in fact, that's an important distinction. We've advised towns not to take title when they take over a cemetery by abandonment, because case law says if all you're doing is mowing and weeding, you're not responsible if someone gets injured on that cemetery. Unless the town actually is conducting burials, which isn't the case in this, we advise against taking title, because then liability transfers. And guess what happened here? They took title. There's a quitclaim deed. So actually the record on the issue of the transfer of title supports that this was a voluntary conveyance. It was his right. When there's a deed, there's a voluntary conveyance, and guess what? There's a deed. I can read my handwriting.
I thought we lost it there.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm still here. Yeah, I think one of the things division hasn't considered is the impact if this was an abandonment. The statute, I can't remember if it's the statute or the reg, says that if you receive abandonment funds, that cemetery is permanently abandoned. If the town of Cicero does not receive abandonment funds, that cemetery could actually one day be reconstituted as a public cemetery. If they receive this $5,000, that's the end of that possibility. That's a huge mistake. They got $6,000 when this was transferred to them. They could buy this mower with that $6,000 and leave themselves the option of one day reconstituting that cemetery a public cemetery. So there are implications to this that I don't think have been considered. And the last thing is, if we do put this over to get more records, I would like to see if division did a final audit. It always does that on abandonments, so the town knows what it's getting. And I assume, I hope that there was a final audit here, and I think that might be, that might assist the analysis. So I think that's it.
The short answer is I don't know if we did one. We should have done one. I don't know if we did one.
My view in general is this is an uninformed transaction. They didn't come to the division. I think there's evidence that they thought they were abandoning it and didn't understand and certainly the town didn't understand the consequences. I'm reminded my corp counsel at the city used to say the law is not an ass, and it just doesn't make sense to me that when a cemetery is in conversations with the town, that they are in worse shape than if there was no conversations going on. So, I mean, I think that it was an uninformed transaction and that it was an abandonment. I think that's different than others that we would see in terms of precedent. That said, I don't mind, well, that's my view. So I would be in favor of approving the transaction. If the board wanted to take a pause to see if there's more evidence, or if there's ways to try to get more conversation with town officials, or if there are any people that we contacted that were on the board time, what their intentions were. I'm not sure that's dispositive in terms of the board's authority, but I think that wouldn't be a necessarily bad option at this point. Tony's point that we might be able to see if they can get it reconvene the cemetery is at least worth some time and energy. So I don't know quite where to move.
I mean, it sounds like the disagreement here is really more factual than legal as to what actually happened here. I think in the big picture, we all agree that a conveyance is not an abandonment. So, and I suppose it's, it's a judgment call as to whether on this not particularly great record, there are sufficient facts to say this was in fact abandoned. Because I don't think there's any real disagreement as to the bigger.
It's just hard to believe that they had an intentional desire to convey it, knowing that they would then not be eligible for funds. Doesn't make sense.
Well, I would.
Anyway, do I have a motion from somebody from either Jill or?
I would agree with Tony that if we can have division look and see if they did a final audit as they would during a real abandonment, that might tip the scales of what the intentions were.
All right, so I'm going to make a motion to table this application and look for additional information to see what the intentions were and what the record might show. Do I have a second?
Second.
Jill, any comments? No, it's on the table. Any additional comments?
No, I'm fine with tabling it. If we had to vote on these facts as they're before us now, I would decline to approve it. But I think that, looking back and getting some more information on the context and, potential indicia of abandonment and reconsidering it is fine.
Okay. So the motion's on the table. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
That motion for the application for town Cicero for the Cicero Cemetery is tabled, and we'll try to get more information. All right, thank you. So we have several applications for major renovations and for columbarium. I took a little bit out of order on the agenda, but the two Pine Lawn cemeteries are next. First one is Pine Lawn Cemetery for a lawn crypt. Does somebody want to present that, Lewis or staff?
Yeah, that's me. Let me just call it up on my computer. Pine Lawn has a fairly extensive set of lawn crypts. I think they last did them in 2017. They're selling reasonably well. Was it 2017? That was when what's it called did theirs. Ferncliff. It was a couple of years ago. I remember we reviewed it. This is a set of lawn crypts that's in the same general area as their existing lawn crypts. They sell well. The specs are the same on the manufactured. They retested. So let me just clarify on the testing. They did a percolation test in this very spot. They have a new manufacturer's certification. The underlying technical specifications for the concrete are the same as their previous application because the product is unchanged from their previous application. The cost of this is a drop in the bucket compared to what they're going to return. It's under $500,000 for a return of almost $4 million. And like I said, they sell these things out pretty well. This isn't quite the same situation we had with Ferncliff. They're not completely running out of them, but if they think they're ready for a new section, we would recommend no objection to it. It's clearly going to make money over time, and the site is a reasonable site for it.
Are there any questions from board members on this application? Again, I think Tony reminds us that we have no objection on these resolutions.
No questions.
No questions.
All right, I'll make a motion that we have no objection to the application of Pine Lawn Cemetery for an additional lawn crypt. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Jill. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. There's another application from Pine Lawn Cemetery for new roadway.
It's kind of two applications.
Say again?
There's kind of two applications, actually. There's two different roads.
Okay.
One of which is a fairly extensive rebuild with drainage of a road along the Long Island Road. I wouldn't say along, it's parallel to, but not within any easement from the Long Island Railroad. It's the southernmost east-west road of the main section of the cemetery. It's the fastest way to go from east to west and vice versa in the cemetery. There are no burials right along it, though. And they want to reconstruct the beginning part of it over towards where the new Long Island Railroad Station is. They're going to be installing some drainage and all that. The other piece of it is just a little tiny extension, paving of an unpaved road. They've got a new mausoleum section we approved a while back, where they're, I'd say, 2/3 to 3/4 of the way done with the buildings. And I guess they're at the point now where they want to have one piece of paved access to that new section. So right now, there's a road in the mausoleum section that dead ends at a fence, and they want to pave the next 150 feet to lead up to the first 2 mausoleum buildings. They're not. I asked why they weren't. The main question I had is why they're not paving the rest. But I think they want access from the other side of the complex to remain unpaved while they have construction vehicles going back and forth from it. I've confirmed with them they don't need any permits for any of this. It's all entirely within the cemetery. And each of the, let's see, I'm looking for the exact numbers in the report. The total cost of this is about $300,000. It's coming out of general fund. They have $15 million in the general fund and almost $93 million in combined funds. Obviously, it's not a revenue producing thing, so we haven't tried to calculate a return on investment, but I've been on the longer road. I've definitely been on several times, and it's kind of a bone crunching journey to go on it. It's really rather pitted. And the other piece, they do need to have paved access if they're going to begin selling spots in these mausoleums. They can't have people coming in across dirt roads rutted by construction vehicles' wheels.
Okay, so are there any questions from board members on these two-part application for roadway improvements?
It looks pretty
No,
cool.
thank you.
Mark, if I could just add, just to make the record clear,
Thank you, Ken. Sorry.
one of the projects is a road improvement of $186,000 estimated, and the other one is $111,160 estimated. So those are the 2 major renovations that are before the board.
Great. And I neglected to ask Tony, any other comments from council on this application?
No, the financials are contained in the other application, the lawn crypts. One was before us recently enough that we've gone over their financials. They're obviously very healthy, so they can well afford.
All right, so I'll make a motion to approve. And Tony, we approve this, no objection, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so I'll make a motion to approve this application for 2 roadway improvements at Pine Lawn Cemetery. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you, Tom. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. Thank you very much. Next on the list is Fort Plains Cemetery for a columbarium. Lewis or Stan?
Mike, are you on the line? Do you want to do this one? Mike's muted. All right, let me call it up then. Fort Plains. Where's the... Shoot. Let me make sure this is the complete thing. Okay, go ahead. Sorry about that. So Fort Plains, this is they're basically buying a very small prefab columbarium. They do not have any columbarium. They feel they need to have one to be able to offer that product. I think it's a 16-unit columbarium, so I think they're basically just testing the water with this. This is not part of a larger project, but my assumption is they'll go and buy another one of these if it's successful. It's kind of at one edge of the cemetery, one corner of the cemetery. It's not in a section where not in a developed section. You can see that both from the map and from the photo. It's, like I said, it's a 16 unit prefab unit. There are no related parties. They're going to be installing it for a total of about, hold on. Sorry, I scrolled down to the bottom and now I got to get back to the top. So total cost of it is just under 18,000. That's about a tenth of their general fund. They think they've projected 3 years selling it out in 3 years. We think we went with 4 years to be a little more conservative. They're going to make 21% a year at that. So it's going to generate revenue for the cemetery, but I think the main part of the purpose here is to make a small investment to see whether they in fact have demand for this, at which point my guess is they'll go out and buy bigger these units. They also have a fairly, compared to their general fund, they have a fairly sizable PM fund of just at cost under 1.1, just under 1.1 million.
Okay, thank you, Louis. Are there any questions from the board?
I should have added they posted the required signs and they received no adverse comments. I don't think they received any comments at all, but certainly no adverse comments.
Let me rephrase. Tony, is there anything you have to add on this application?
Not too much. As Louis pointed out, it is their first, so it's a little untested, but they're starting small. You have the funds to pay for it. The only minor issue, the posted notice is required to have the address and telephone number where comments can be received. They put the address and an email address. I think including an email address is fine, but the telephone number is required by the regs, so I ask that division make sure that when these things get posted that there is a telephone number as well. Other than that, I have no comments.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Any questions from the members of the board?
None here.
None from me, no.
Thank you both. Okay, I'll make a motion to approve the application for Fort Plain Cemetery for a columbarium. Do you have a second? Second, Jill, favor, thank you. And all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. The application is approved. Finally, I think, is an application from Woodlawn Cemetery in Syracuse for a new retort. Louis, do you want to present that or have staff present that?
Sorry, I'd rather Mike do it, but he wasn't able on before, so I'll give him a sec, and if he doesn't, I'll do it. Oh, you're unmuted, Mike. Go nuts. Let me mute. Mike, you seem to be unmuted. We're not hearing anything.
All right, Louis.
All right, I'll go ahead and do it. Let me just call it up. Give me a sec. Here we go. So, Woodlawn Cemetery opened a new crematory back in 2015. They had originally wanted to put 2 retorts, but we asked them to do only 1 at the time. They revised their application to do only 1. The retorts, they're not, I would say they're not quite at capacity on their first retort, but they're getting close to it. And they want to add a second retort. We did a fairly extensive review of cremation trends both in the county and in the broader region. Cremations have ticked up slightly over time. Over the last 4 years, there hasn't been a dramatic increase. I think I saw some recent statistics from Cana. It looks like the state overall has not had a dramatic increase in its cremation rate, unlike certain other places in the last couple of years. It's gone up, it's been basically flat. That said, we think it's really important for them we're for this application more because we think it's important for them to have backup capacity, and because we think over time there will be an increase in the demand for cremation in the Syracuse area. We were a little concerned about Oakwood Cemetery when they opened up. Oakwood Cemetery did take a little bit of hit in their business, but it's not been a dramatic night and day thing where the one is wiping them out. Oakwood is still going to remain a larger operation, so we're not overly concerned that them having 2 retorts at Woodlawn is suddenly going to put Oakwood's operations in peril. We think the market can sustain both of them, and most importantly, we just think the having 2 retorts extends the life of both and avoids problems if one goes down for repairs at the time of heavy use. Again, we're not faced with the situation we were faced with last month, where there's an issue of a prohibition on a crematory expanding because they had no business doing what they're doing unless they were grandfathered. This is a cemetery operation, and there's no legal restriction on them expanding.
Thank you, Louis. Council, do you have any additional comments?
Yeah, just a few. Financially, this looks like the cemetery can certainly afford the investment in a second retort. No issues that I saw with the cemetery's finances. Mike Seelman reported some problems with the operation of their current operation of their crematory, but apparently this was very recent, July. This occurred, so division will have to go back and make sure that they've made the proper changes to their procedures to avoid the problems that occurred in the past. The only issue other than those that I see is with regard to Oakwood. The NPCL 1505-A has a bunch of requirements when a new crematory is established that the board has to consider before approving it. And a lot of them are applicable to the addition of a retort, especially paragraph 4, which requires a description of the impact of the proposed crematory on other crematories and the impact on the surrounding community. So I think the impact on Oakwood is something the board should consider. I had suggested that Oakwood be advised that this application was pending so they could appear and be heard. I don't know if that has happened. The other item I have to say, this isn't a money-making proposal. Having this retort isn't going to increase the number of cremations. The number of cremations will only go up if cremations become more popular in the area. But it is going to be a backup. It will provide them a cushion. And once cremations do increase to the point that the 1 retort isn't sufficient, it'll be there to assist with that. So there's good reason for the investment, but it isn't a money maker per se.
So Oakwood isn't, I don't know if Oakwood's on the line. I can call attention to the numbers we did. Oakwood took a bit of a hit when Woodlawn opened up, but in 2019, they recovered almost to where they were in 2015 before there was Woodlawn. And like I said, I don't think, like Tony said, we don't think that this is going to significant. There may be a little bit of an increase in the short term in the number of cremations they're doing, but we don't think this is going to, in and of itself, dramatically increase the number of cremations at Woodlawn. So for that reason, we think that any impact it's going to have at Oakwood is going to be fairly minimal. Again, the worst, the biggest decline Oakwood had was in 2017, and they were down 250 cases out of a total of almost 2,500. And like I said, that's now recovered. They're now with it about 50 cases of where they were before there was a Woodlawn crematory.
Is there anybody, any of the stakeholders involved in this, including Oakwood, wishing to speak to the board?
if Oakwood's not there, this is David Fleming representing Woodlawn. Just to reiterate a couple of things that were stated, I think one of the issues here is that by the division's own memorandum to the board outlining the request or the analysis of the application, Woodlawn has exceeded the normal operations for one retort within a year, where you might have issues associated with repairs. If they were to have repairs now, that means they'd have to shut down, which is not a great situation for the cemetery, and it's not a great situation for the region. Additionally, I'd note that as the board members are well aware, Woodlawn in Syracuse was one of the few crematories that the state relied on during the first wave of the pandemic to handle all sorts of funeral home needs related to cremation across the city. So they really are and have been part of the pandemic response for the state, and they even had refrigeration trucks on the site to accept bodies. Had they gone down because of the significant usage that they were experiencing, it would have dramatically impacted the state's response to the pandemic. And for those reasons, as well as the ones outlined by the division and council, we suggest that this is a very good application for not just the state, but for the cemetery.
Thank you, David. Is there any additional questions from members of the board in terms of this application?
I have one question. Louis, you had mentioned that in their previous application, they had applied for 2 and were approved for 1. Are there any concerns that were applicable at that time that would still be applicable now, or is the factual scenarios different and that we need not consider whatever caused the decision to only approve 1?
Well, let me clarify that a bit. They initially applied for 2. There was some back and forth with us. They modified their application before the matter was presented to the board to restrict it to 1. So the board didn't deny them a second retort. That was a matter of some negotiation with us. Our concern was putting in 2 retorts before they have a track record as to 1 was a bit of a risky proposition. That was issue number 1. Issue number 2 is we didn't know what they would do to Oakwood, and we were concerned that they would really cut into their business. Our estimate of how much they would cut into their business, if I recall correctly, ended up being pretty accurate. It wasn't that big a hit, which is what we projected when we recommended approval. And because we actually did a fairly detailed survey of the local directors to find out who might switch, and from there. Then the other third wrinkle is that we hadn't had a pandemic back in 2015. And I think the need for a second retort where there wasn't a statutory prohibition on it is much clearer now than it was then.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have
I'll
no,
make a motion to approve the application from Woodlawn Cemetery for a new retort. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. Jill, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Application is approved. I think that's the end of our applications. Next meeting date, Louis?
You think?
Don't say
I won't say
September.
What?
I don't want September to come. Come on. Kidding.
Okay. August 39th,
Thank you.
September 8th.
September 8th. The next board meeting will be September 8th. We always appreciate having this meeting in public and the opportunity for public for the public to speak. Is there anybody from the public wishing to speak to the board? Again, anyone from the public wishing to speak to the board? Okay, doesn't sound like there is. So we don't need executive session So I will take a motion to adjourn the August board meeting.
Second.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you all very much for your participation. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.